Welcome to 24 Hours Have Passed Summit Preview. We're excited you could join us today for Brent Ozar's session, Developers Who Needs a DBA. This 24 Hours Have Passed event consists of 24 consecutive live webcasts. To access any of the on-demand sessions, please refer to 24hoursofpass.com for the session links. My name is Vicki Van Dam, and I am the project manager for Pass HQ. I have a few quick introductory slides before I hand the reins over to Brent. He's going to present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to Q&A, and you can ask any questions that you may have. If you're having any issues, please type your questions or issues into the question pane, and we'll be here to assist you. You can use the Zoom button located on the top of your presentation window if you need to zoom in or to improve your visibility onto any part of the presentation. And again, continue to ask your questions throughout the presentation. The question pane is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Brent is going to take a look at the questions as we go, and at the end of the session, if there's any left, I'll read them aloud. Note that there is going to be a short evaluation that will come up at the end of the session. Your feedback is very important to us and to our speakers, so please take a moment to complete it. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors with whom we could not have this great free training for the PASS community, Microsoft and Dell Software. As you may know, this 24 Hours of PASS is a preview of the upcoming PASS Summit 2014, the largest conference for SQL Server and BI professionals. With over 5,000 attendees representing 2,000 companies from 52 countries, Summit is a time to share, connect, and learn with your peers and industry partners. PASS Summit is not only a week of intensive learning and knowledge sharing that'll offer strategic insights, it's a time to network and rub shoulders with industry experts. Taking place in Seattle from November 4th to 7th, PASS Summit will feature over 190 world-class sessions across 5 topic tracks. These 24 Hours of PASS sessions provide a mere glimpse of what you can expect from PASS Summit. Find out more at www.passsummit.com, and if you register by September 26th using the discount code on the screen here, 24HOP14, you'll get $200 off your registration. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our presenter, Brent Ozar. Brent Ozar is a SQL Server MCM, a Microsoft SQL Server MVP, and the co-author of Professional SQL Server 2008, Internals and Troubleshooting. Take it away, Brent.
Thanks, Vicki. Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about developers who needs a DBA. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of you inside this webcast are actually DBAs who are coming to spy on what I would tell developers, so we'll see how that goes. We're going to start by meeting Dan. Dan is a developer that I've worked with. Now, he's been working with Visual Studio for the last 4 or 5 years. He's pretty comfortable building tables and writing queries to get the data in and out that he wants. He's even vaguely comfortable doing some query tuning, but he's really got his hands full just doing development work. Dan would love to get some help from a database administrator, but Dan doesn't have a database administrator. Dan's company builds applications, and some of Dan's stuff is for internal users, some of it is for external users that they sell apps. And they just can't afford to hire DBAs because, you know, these DBAs who are sitting in the audience now, they know how highly paid DBAs are. They have a lot of free time to sit around and watch training webcasts. See, I caught you. Dan's company won't hire a DBA because of Dan's manager. Dan's manager has all these romantic ideas about what application development is like. Dan's manager likes to say things like, "When I was your age, I perfectly developed all of my code. I hand-reviewed every query execution plan. I knew exactly the difference between seeks and scans, when I should add indexes and when I should not add indexes. I also laid out all the buttons on the screen. When I was your age, there was no such thing as a user experience developer. I just had to do everything myself, and it was all flawless." So he doesn't understand why Dan would ever even need a DBA. Now, out here in reality, Dan likes to remind his boss that I've seen your work. I know that it isn't actually all that good and that your code is the biggest thing I have to go back and fix these days because that stuff is horrific. So Dan has some problems, and we're going to solve them with 5 easy steps. As long as he can follow these 5 things, he's going to get much faster databases. Now, at PASS, during my full session of this is actually a smaller part of a bigger session I'm doing at PASS, I'm also going to talk about things like security, availability, and backups. But for this first session, we're just going to talk about the easy way to make databases faster in 5 steps. First off, we're going to show you how to start every brand new table that you create. Second and third, we're going to talk about some easy weekly routines that you can do as a developer to make this thing go fast. Fourth, when performance totally goes into the toilet, I'm going to show you where to go look. And then fifth, I'm going to show you where to go learn more about all of these topics. We are going to start out with the first one, the standard. Whenever you go and build a new table, I want to make sure that you don't build a heap. A heap is a table with no clustered index. We tell SQL Server, here's a list of fields I want to track, but I'm not going to tell you what makes it unique or what order you should put it in. Heaps can be very fast under certain circumstances. If I need to load a whole lot of data and I really don't care where it goes in the database, there are circumstances where heaps are the fastest way to do it. That's cool, but you don't just load data into a database. You need to get it back out. You need to do small inserts, updates, and deletes over time. It's not like you just load all this data once and then walk away from the database server. What we need to do is SQL Server politely ignores heaps. SQL Server says, well, all right, you've told me you just want to stuff data into the database. I'm going to do it, but I'm just going to look the other way whenever performance is going awry. SQL Server has a lot of hints that it will give us. We're going to leverage those hints in steps 2 and 3. But if you don't tell SQL Server what order to put the data in, SQL Server says, I guess you decide you're just really in a hurry, so I'm not going to clean up after you and I'm not going to make any suggestions. So because of that, we're going to start every single table that we build by default with a clustered index. This is an easy thing that you can do when you're doing data modeling. We're going to tell SQL Server, these are the fields that make SQL Server store the data in a specific order. Often people use an identity field. They'll create an ID field that's an integer, starts at 1 and goes up to a bazillion, however many records we have in the table. But let's take a bigger view of what we're dealing with here. The reason people usually use integers and identities is because SQL Server functions best when clustered indexes match 4 characteristics: narrow, unique, static, and ever-increasing, or as I like to call it, the news. Narrow means it's as little data as possible that we're using to store the data in order. An identity, an integer field, is a small, tiny int that hardly takes up any space on the page. This becomes important as we start to add non-clustered indexes later. You don't have to research into that right now. You just need to know that the fields need to be narrow. This does technically mean that GUIDs, big, long, 36, 32 character, I always forget which one it is, strings, so to speak, are not very efficient. They take up a lot more space. Even if you need to store a GUID, that may be okay. I just may not want to put the data in the order of that GUID. Same thing with using 4, 5, 6 fields that make the data unique. Sometimes in data warehousing, for example, we say that, well, really, it's a combination of these 4, 5, 6 different fields. Okay, but we're probably not designing a data warehouse. We're probably designing relatively small applications, say under a terabyte, and we may want to put an ID and an integer on that table just to make something narrow in here. Second, it needs to be unique. I don't want to store things by, say, order ID if I've got 1,000 rows for the same order ID in a table. I may need to add something like order ID and line ID. The reason behind that is that if it isn't unique, SQL Server is going to go back behind the scenes and add something called a uniqueifier to make it unique for you. That's going to take extra space, and SQL Server also has to do extra work when you do these insert, update, and deletes to make sure that there is something unique about that table. Sam Jones reminds me, goods are 32 characters. Good. Bonus points for you this morning, Sam. One of us has had our coffee. I've had my coffee. It's right over here. I just haven't had enough of it yet. Have I ever had enough coffee? Has anyone ever had enough coffee? The answer is no. Third thing that we look for is static. I don't want to have something that changes all of the time, because if it changes, I have to go update all of my non-clustered indexes as well. I want to minimize that kind of overhead. That's why we say to make it static. And then finally, ever increasing. This is where identity integers start to pay off, because we're always adding data at the tail end of the table. Back a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, people used to say that, oh, that means there's going to be a hotspot at the end of the table. Well, if you're continuously inserting data faster than your storage can keep up in one particular location, then you're going to run into problems. That is the exception rather than the rule. I know we're thinking we're building these big, awesome applications. SQL Server can hardly keep up with all of my insert activity. But it's not unusual to see 10, 50, 100,000 batch requests a second these days that are doing inserts and not really running into a hotspot issue. Martin says, how can you check for that said hotspot to know if we're running into it? If you don't know how to check, you should follow the guidelines on this screen. That's a great example of why I give these kinds of guidelines to developers without a DBA. By the time you are running into those kinds of issues, you're going to learn them with step 4 in this checklist. Then I'll make exceptions once we hit those tables. Now, common objections whenever there's those DBAs in the room, and they're keeping quiet right now. They're not asking questions yet because they're still kind of checking out whether or not I'm making sense in this presentation. Those rocket surgeon DBAs are like, no, wait a minute here. My table's really small, or my table gets cached in data anyway, or I'm just loading this once for staging, or my doctor said heaps are better. Okay, when you get to the point where you have a DBA, then you can start breaking some of those rules. But you need to understand the mechanisms behind the rules first before you go off and break them. You got to learn to crawl before you go trying to run a half marathon. So the second thing that we're going to do, after we've got clustered indexes on all of our tables as we're moving forward, is we're going to start checking our indexes just once a week. Now, SQL Server has awesome built-in instrumentation. These things are called dynamic management views, or dynamic management functions, or dynamic management objects, or system tables. DBAs like to use a lot of different terms to make things sound harder than they actually are. Now, these DMVs actually do kind of suck to join. It is kind of painful to join these together and figure out exactly what you need in terms of indexes. There's a lot of wacko scripts out there. I like to rely on one written by Kendra Little. She's a Microsoft Certified Master and MVP. She actually makes these DMVs fun to read. This whole thing is written in terms of like a psychologist analyzing your indexes. Tell me more about your feelings. And it has all kinds of warnings. What you're going to do is go get it. It installs in the master database, or you can put it somewhere else if you feel like it. And when you run it inside the database that you want to examine, the database that you're trying to tune and make go faster. Now, when you run this, we've got somebody typing there. Bernadette, I think I'm gonna mute you there just for a second. Mute Bernadette. There we go. When you run it, you're going to get all of these reports back about multiple personalities, hoarder, obsessive compulsive, feature phobic. You're going to get all kinds of really interesting warnings with URLs about how you go off and interpret these. It can get kind of intimidating though, and I only want you to focus on 2 warnings. First off, hoarding. Hoarding means you've added a whole lot of extra indexes that no one's actually using. You can create lots of indexes. SQL Server won't stop you. SQL Server has this awful tool called the Database Engine Tuning Advisor. It used to be called the Index Tuning Wizard, but we learned pretty early on that that wizard only cast evil spells. The problem with the Database Tuning Advisor is anytime you hand it a query, it goes, I'm going to make an index for you to make that query go faster. And it has no comprehension that every time we do inserts, updates, and deletes into our table, that index slows us down. See, every index that you add now, if I have just one index, I write one thing to storage. If I have two indexes, I write two things to storage every time we're doing an insert or a delete. 3 indexes, 10 indexes. That's now 10 times more work that you have to throw at storage. This is why DBAs get frustrated and they say things like, we're getting 15-second I/O timeouts. Well, if you'd have less indexes, this wouldn't be such a problem. Now, I have clients who throw dozens or hundreds of indexes per table because they have all solid-state storage and they can cache nearly the entire database in RAM. If you're not doing that, you've got to ease up on creating all of these indexes. SP Blitz Index tells you, have these indexes been used? Now, it gets a little tricky about when they were used. See, these dynamic management views reset every time SQL Server restarts, every time the instance restarts. And there's also a bug in SQL Server 2012 and newer that whenever you rebuild an index, it also resets these statistics. So we don't want to go wild and crazy with rebuilding our indexes all the time. Plus, it just generates a lot of transaction log load. And what I generally want to do is if an index hasn't been used in 30 days or more, I want to eject it, get it out of here, and I'll talk a little bit more about why. Second part of this is missing indexes. SQL Server, as long as it's going off and executing queries, SQL Server goes, man, I sure wish I would have had an index on person name or order amount. And it's tracking all of that. You can query it. SP Blitz Index outputs that. It'll tell you how many times the query would have been used, how much of a difference it would have made, and SP Blitz Index breaks all of that down for you. Now, the DBAs in the room are like, hold on a second, it's not really that easy. You can't go creating indexes all the time or dropping indexes. Well, that's sort of true. It's easy as long as you go easy on the new indexes. If you go wild and crazy bashing in creating new indexes every time, then pretty soon your insert updates or deletes are going to slow to a crawl, your backups are going to take longer, your corruption checks are going to take longer, and I'm doing the wave next thing you know. What you want to aim for is 5 or less indexes per table. It's not that you can't go higher. You can if you invest a lot in storage. Another time you can go higher is if that data in the table never changes. A great example, if you've got a list of employees and you only add or drop employees, say, once a week or once a month, then you might be okay indexing the daylights out of that table if you search it very often. Second, I want to aim for 5 or less fields per index. I don't want all kinds of big, long indexes that are basically whole copies of my table that I'm having to keep around. These are good starter rules. As you get to know your database and indexing, when you have more time, you can make more granular requests. But remember, Dan doesn't have a lot of time. Dan doesn't have a DBA. This is something that he needs to be able to do in just an hour or 2 per week. That's where these simple rules come in, and it'll make everybody's life much easier in terms of performance and tuning down the road. Chris Summer points out he already uses SP Blitz Index as well. Chris, I didn't ask if you're a DBA or a developer. If you're a developer, you really get a gold star. You rock. If you're a DBA, get back to work. The session's not for you, unless you're just spying. I see how it is. And DBAs are like that. The next thing that we're going to do once a week is we are going to build the sucker board. Not the leaderboard, the sucker board. SQL Server has query instrumentation DMBs, and it says every single time you run a query, all right, you just ran the customer check query, you just queried employees, you just ran SP whatever, and it tracks how much overhead each of these queries have. How many times did you run it? How many logical reads did it do? How much CPU did you do? How long did it take in order to run? But man, querying this stuff is miserable. This is the kind of thing that when I first started out as a DBA, man, it took me weeks in order to get all of these joins just right. You don't have time for that either. So there's a much easier way to nail this down too. This one's written by Jeremiah Peshka, an MVP who likes to read database engine source code for fun. I am not making that up. Whenever I want to know anything about the internals of how databases work, I ask Jeremiah, and he explains it, and then I have to ask him to slow down and use kindergartner words because I'm not that bright. I just test really well, and Brown knows my teachers. So SP Blitz Cache, it's a lot like SP Blitz Index, but this one runs at the server level. You're going to install it, and it shows up straight in the master database. You can put it somewhere else if you like as well. It'll still work fine. Now, when you run it, I like to run it with, say, top 10. Just show me the top 10 queries, and that's it. Because if you run it with the defaults, it's going to come up with like 50 queries, and it's going to take a long time to analyze all of those queries, because it actually does analyze the queries that it pulls back. More on that in a second. You can say, give me the top 10 by how much data they read, which is the first parameter on there. Sort order equals reads. Because usually when I'm performance tuning, I just want to start by show me which queries read the most data in order to produce their results. Because if they read a lot of data, they probably also had to burn a lot of CPU cycles and took a long time to run. You're also going to want to sort it by CPU or by duration or by execution count. Those are great sort orders as well. I just start with logical reads when I only have a limited amount of time. Now, when you run it, it produces two sets of results. The first set of results is the list of problems that it found in queries. For example, here in this setup, there's some queries are having parameter sniffing issues. Others are having long-running queries that have been running for long periods of time. Some of the queries in this list have missing indexes in them, so all we have to do is add the index, and the amount of reads that they need is going to plummet. Query compilation timeout, all kinds of interesting warnings. And then the bottom set is that list of ugly queries. This is what we call the sucker board. When your queries show up on this list, this is where it's time to go tune those. You don't have an unlimited amount of time. You've only got an hour or two per week in order to do database performance tuning. And you don't want to go through running profiler traces or building all kinds of products trying to capture every query. This way, instead, you can just parachute in and see what have been the most resource-intensive queries and whose fault are they? Who's the sucker that's here in this room? I absolutely adore it for that kind of purpose. What I do is I run this every single Friday. That way it's built up query data from all week long. Friday morning I run this and I look at the top 10 most resource-consuming queries by CPU, by reads, duration, by execution count. Usually there's only, just 2 or 3 queries that are just decimating everything. There's like 2 or 3 queries that are responsible for more than half of all logical reads or more than half of all durations. Often, I didn't know they were the problem queries because there's something that were called by a web service, by an app tier machine, something that runs on the dashboard but nobody ever noticed. They're not usually the queries the users complain about. These are the queries that are beating the server into submission in the background without us knowing about it. So what I'm going to do is go through and say, all right, can I cache this in the application server tier instead? Can I fix these with really simple indexes? How through can I get with just low-hanging fruit before I have to go off and really do some heavy lifting? You are very quickly going to get to a good place fast. I see that you have to do this stuff every week. Usually, folks only have to do this for a month and they're done. Do it for a month sounds bad, right? Like nobody has a month to do. Remember, this is only an hour or two every Friday. You're going to be shocked by which queries immediately show up and you go, oh, this would be an easy fix. I could just cache this and query it once an hour instead of querying it every 100 milliseconds. We'll catch bugs this way. You're going to knock out a lot of easy stuff. And performance on the SQL Server is going to change dramatically. You're going to have a totally different performance footprint. Then the queries that are going to show up on the sucker board are actually going to be hard to tune. But at that point, you've made the server perform so much better just by knocking out this low-hanging fruit. that it's not such a big deal. And what often developers will do is say, well, you know what? Performance is actually pretty good now, and nobody's complaining, so I'm going to stop doing this every Friday. And that's okay. I know, wait a minute, the DBA is telling me I can ignore the database for a little while. Yes, because as long as the users are happy and you're taking care of the clustered indexes, we'll be good to go for a while. But whenever you drop a new release of code, say you go deploy version 24 on a Saturday, the next Friday you're going to want to come back and look at indexes again and look at the plan cache again, because some new queries may have popped up into this list. Now, again, the DBAs in the room are all, it's not exactly perfect. There are times when the plan cache misses stuff. If I have linked to SQL that's an old version, or an nhibernate problem, or encrypted stored procedures, or all these ad hoc SQL strings, it's not going to find it. You have to do harder work than that. Well, yeah, when you want to get really ambitious, all of these are true. But remember, I'm talking about somebody who only has an hour or two a week, and this is a great way to get started for free and not have to hire a DBA just yet. That way, when you do need to hire a DBA and you do need to bring them in to solve those tough problems like those older ORM versions, you don't solve the older ORM versions by hiring a DBA. You solve it by moving to the latest version of nhibernate or link to SQL or entity framework. Marcia says, can you talk a little bit about caching the query? Yes, in applications, if you're calling, a great example is a list of countries. Countries don't change that often. Get it from the database once, store it in an in-memory variable in your application. Does this add more overhead for your application in terms of memory? Sure, but your application, I cough, I have such a bad reaction to that statement. But it's so much easier to add memory to your application. SQL Server, if we have to add CPU power in order to process your query, SQL Server licensing is $2,000 a core for standard edition and $7,000 a core US for enterprise edition. I do not want to incur any more extra load on the SQL Server when I can simply cache things in the app instead. So the fourth thing that Dan's going to learn to do is triage. This is a medical term. When you're brought into the emergency room, you see a triage nurse, and the triage nurse looks at you and says, you know what, a hangnail really isn't an emergency. Why don't you go have a seat over there? We'll be with you shortly. Whereas this woman over here who's going into anaphylactic shock because she got, a bad reaction from, chicken or whatever it was that she ate, we need to see her immediately or she's going to be in bad shape. Or gunshot wounds from your SAN administrator. I know how that happens. I was there. So Dan's manager comes running in and he says the same thing every time. The website is down. The application is slow. And you ask him what queries they are. And he goes, I don't know. That's your problem. And you have to figure out what's actually going wrong. Man, SQL Server's tools to do this are not very efficient. There are a couple of stored procedures called SP-WHO and SP-WHO2. There's this thing called Activity Monitor, which when you leave it open actually makes your performance worse by a lot. Activity Monitor's queries are some of the worst queries in terms of performance that I've ever seen, so you can actually make the problem worse. Now, you could try and write your own diagnostic view queries. Again, you're going to sense a theme here. You're a smart, attractive person, even at this ungodly hour of the day. And you're saying, Brent, there's no way you're going to sucker me into writing a tool for this when I know someone smart out there has already done all the work hard work for me. And indeed, they have. In this case, it's what I like to call Atom Mechanic's amazing tool. Atom Mechanic is an MVP, used to teach the Microsoft Certified Master classes, and he's written an amazing DMV query called SP-WHO-IS-ACTIVE. You're going to download that and install it before disaster strikes. It goes into your master database and you can run it from anywhere. It's totally safe. It's read-only, just like all of these other tools. I even like to give this to the help desk. I like to let the help desk, run this Go query and go see what's going on inside my database. Now, the first column over here in these result sets is how long has the query been running. I should back up a little. There'll be a row in here in these result sets for every query that is currently running on the SQL Server right now. This is triage tool. What's on fire right now in my SQL Server? You run this, and if it takes more than a few seconds, you really do have a problem on your SQL Server. Usually this thing's blazing fast, even under times of incredible duress and shotguns coming in. So the first column that comes in there is how long has this query been running for? In this case, you can see it's been running for just 1.6 seconds. It's not uncommon to see things that have been running for hours or for days. If you see something like that that's been running for hours or days, it may be a runaway query in your application, or somebody left a transaction open, and there are going to be steps that you're going to look at in order to check it out. You can actually click on the query text, and it will give you the query that the user sent in or that the application sent in, exactly as it was, with line break formats and all that, and even stored procedure calls. It tells you their session ID, which is useful if you want to kill that query. Now, I will warn you, if a query is doing a lot of work, if you've been running a big, long update query that's been running for hours, and you go to kill it, you can run into problems because it'll take a long time to roll back, and there is no quick way to cancel that rollback. You restart the SQL Server, it's still going to continue rolling back. Even worse, rollback is single-threaded. So if you had a query that was doing a whole lot of work across lots of cores, and then all of a sudden you go to roll it back and we're only using one core to undo that work, it may take a stratospheric amount of time. So be really careful when you go off and kill queries. Don't take that kind of thing lightly. It also tells you about the wait info for that particular query. This is, as you start to get more advanced in troubleshooting, will tell you what SQL Server is waiting on right now, like maybe blocking. As you scroll across to the right in the result sets, it can also tell you things like % complete. Now, there's a big gotcha here that only works for things like database restores. It doesn't work for individual queries. Wah, 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 wah. It tells you the host name that it's coming from. The call is coming from inside the house. What database it's being executed in, what program name it's coming from. And this is why I'm working with developers when I tell them you have to identify your application name in the connection string. This will help you do it. So when you have 100 application servers or services that are all running on the same server, now you're going to be able to know exactly which service is sending this ugly query. Totally fantastic, totally free. You should have it on every SQL Server that you have and be familiar with it before you go off and try and troubleshoot disaster. The next query that you're going to run for emergency triage is SP Ask Brent, which was written by an amazingly smart, not to mention good-looking fella that just happens to be named Brent Ozar. This one, like the rest of them, installs in master, totally safe to do, and then runs at the server level. What this one does is say take a 5-second sample of your perfmon counters, wait stats, running queries, all kinds of interesting counters, and then figures out what is the reason that the SQL Server is slow right now. SP Who is Active tells you which queries are running, which is very useful. But it doesn't tell you, for example, system-related tasks. Where'd my mouse go? There we go. So, for example, in this case, rows 2 and 3, we have an emergency problem with SQL Server. A database file is growing and a log file is growing because somebody's dumping a whole lot of data into the database. One of the things that's a drawback with the way SQL Server works is that when a data file has to grow or a log file has to grow, all activity in the database comes to a complete halt. Everybody is blocked while SQL Server does this internal maintenance of growing out a file. This is why setting your file growth settings is so interesting. If we tell SQL Server every time this file grows, I want it to grow by 10 gigs, and it takes your storage a long time to write out those 10 gigs, maybe I don't want to set my file growths at such a big whopping increment. Maybe I need to go smaller. Then it also tells you things like, for example, the planned cache has been erased recently, page life expectancy is low, we're doing a lot of queries and burning through a lot of the RAM in our server, there's a backup going on, and we have locking issues as well. All kinds of interesting stuff that it tells you about why the SQL Server is broken right now. If there are no problems found, if everything's hunky-dory on the SQL Server, it'll also return that. It'll say there are no problems right now, everything's good here. So this is another one that I like to give to my help desk staff. Same thing with if you're an ISV developer. If you sell applications to other people to install on their SQL servers, you give them SP Who is Active and SP Ask Brent, so that when your support teams go in there and take a look, support teams can go, oh, look, right now there's a big restore going on. Why is that? Or there's an agent job that's been running for 4 hours. They get very quick, easy answers without having to dig through all kinds of stuff. If you turn on expert mode, now normally this isn't something that I would tell developers about, but you guys look particularly intelligent, especially for this time of the day. So I will tell you guys about this one. When you start getting fancy and putting on your pants 2 legs at a time, you can run it with @expert mode equals 1, and it returns all kinds of additional information after the first result set. It doesn't do any extra checking. It just gives you out more information that these are all the things I looked at while I was doing my troubleshooting. For example, what were the wait stats on the server during this sampling? And one of my favorite result sets, this bottom one here, says the number of reads and writes that we're dealing with. So in this example, during that 5-second sample, I did 2,097 writes over to this AdventureWorks file on drive C. I read or wrote, in this case I read, 16 megs worth of data, and my drives were responding within 1 millisecond. So if you're ever wondering, is my storage fast enough to keep up, now you're going to be able to see at a glance. If your storage wasn't keeping up, Ask Brent would tell you up in the top of the result sets here, hey, your drives are responding a little on the slow side right now. But if you're really curious and you want to dig into the details, you can get that as well. That does not make database and their administrators in the room particularly happy, but it really is that easy. Man, you put in a brand new, I was going to say CD, but SQL Server hasn't fit on a CD for years. You put in SQL Server, install it, and you go next, 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 without even doing anything that you should be doing when you set up SQL Server. SQL Server can still maintain itself for a pretty long time. It can do a pretty good job as long as you follow a few basic rules. You follow these rules, and you're going to be off to the races for a really long time. You're going to go do way better than you expect. So the rules are, first you start every table with a clustered index. This is the one simple step that makes things way easier for all of SQL Server's dynamic management views. There are exceptions when you should use heaps. Just don't start out that way until you can prove that they're faster for a specific purpose. Second, in production, every Friday, go run SP Blitz Index, disable the indexes that you don't need, and add the indexes that you do need. Third, run SP Blitz Cache and start building your sucker board. Copy-paste those results into Excel, send them out to the team, and it's like this awesome competition because as soon as people show their queries up, I see their queries up there going, oh, that's a stored procedure I wrote. I better go fix that so that I'm not embarrassed anymore. Wham! All of a sudden, query tuning gets way easier. You don't have to build every query perfectly. You don't have to tune every stored procedure and function perfectly. In the immortal words of a philosopher, ain't nobody got time for that. All you have to do is make sure that the ones who are up on the sucker board get out as quickly as possible. And the ones that really are tough can stay up there. When performance disaster strikes, go ahead and run SP Who is Active to find out which queries are running right now, and SP Ask Brent to find out why the server is slow. And then I've got the resources from all of this, plus detailed evidence to back it up for the DBAs over at ozar.me/get/confident. Now, I am going to take questions, but first I want to point out that Dan is going to become the new DBA. Database administration is an awesome career. If you decide that you want to stop learning a new language every week, I have so much respect for developers because your learning never stops. You got to learn new languages, new frameworks, the ORM du jour. And with SQL, T-SQL's been the same for like 20 years. It's not changing. They give us a new functionality like once every 5 years. It does involve learning, but it's more about systems and architecture. And it's a really fun way to get a long career, and database administrators make a lot of money. Dan is also today attending these sessions at the 24 hours of pass. He's also going to hit the statistics and heuristics session, which is, I think, a really good eye-opener for developers who are starting to learn more about why SQL Server makes some of the crazy decisions it makes with execution plans. Why does SQL Server choose to use this index and not that index? Troubleshoot performance like Microsoft, where you've got guys from former Microsoft Premier Field Engineers and CSS guys who are going to explain the tools that Microsoft use. These are more advanced and more complex than the tools I just gave you, but it's kind of good to see eye-opening how hard some of this stuff can get. Query performance tuning, of course, does exactly what it says on the tin. I've seen that session and it's fantastic. And then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's GMT, it's actually pretty late for Jess, is Jess Schultz-Borland with Are Your Indexes Hurting or Helping You? And then eventually, if you're really lucky, your boss will send you to the PASS Summit. This is an international conference that's held once a year. This year it's in Seattle in November, where 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people descend on in this case it's the Seattle Conference Center, Seattle Convention Center, downtown Seattle. You wouldn't believe the number of people who do exactly the same thing that you do and are struggling to learn just the same way that you are. The sessions are fantastic. It's great for networking, and you can even buy DVDs of all the sessions because there are like 20 sessions going on at the same time a day anyway. You buy the DVDs so that when you go home, you can see what those sessions were like. So now we will knock out some of the questions. Let's see here. Heinin says, is this available offline? Because he missed the entire thing. If you go down to ozar.me/get/confident, you can see the highlight notes. Plus, PASS will be distributing the recordings of all these, so you get emailed whenever the recordings are up. Alvaro says, what about dealing with third-party apps that you cannot change? Alvaro, you snuck into this meeting. You are not a developer. You are a database administrator. See, you're trying to cheat. Now, this session was for developers who are changing their applications. Justin says, nice work, sir. This is really good stuff, and thanks for putting it out there for free. You're welcome. My whole mission with giving back to the community and doing stuff like this with the past 24 Hop, the blogs and webcasts, all the stuff that we do, is to make life suck less than it did for me as I was coming up. I was a developer, and I use the term developer really loosely because I suck pretty bad. I did classic VB script, classic ASP, Clarion, all kinds of crappy old languages. And I was really frustrated because all I had was really dry books when I was trying to learn stuff. This is one of the things I love about 24 Hours of Pass. There's so much good free stuff out there. Samuel Jones says, speaking as a DBA, see, we had another cheater in here. Can you believe it? Developers in the audience, DBAs just want to get right in there and know what you know. Sam says, speaking as a DBA, I'd love it if my devs did their own basic troubleshooting and design. That frees me up for the more complicated stuff. I hear this a lot from database administrators. There was a great session, user group session. I can't remember if it was Jess Borland or Doug Lane. These are the things I want from my developers, and it laid out this basic rule set to say, if you do these, you're going to make my life easier because I just need a predictable system that makes it easier to change. Let's see here. Next, lots of people saying thanks. You're welcome. Adriana from Houston. I'm from been to Houston for several times. Victor from Portugal says thanks. Good session. Absolutely. You guys are welcome. Ryan says, will you be posting this session on your site? It's already there, thanks to the magic of technology. Ryan says, I'm asking for a developer friend of mine. Right story. Sure you are. Shob says, Brent, don't give our DBA secrets away. Yes, absolutely. You got it. So feel free to ask any other questions that you've got in there. Feel free to fire those away over in the question pane there. We've still got about 5-6 minutes left here for questions before we free everybody up to go off over to the next session. The next session, actually I should say in here because there's a slide for it. Oh, and Vicki may want to say this, but Vicki, are you muted? No, she's muted, so I'll go ahead and say it. So if you like what you heard here today, I will also be presenting at the PASS Summit. I have 2 sessions, Developers Who Needs a DBA. We're also going to backups and security so you can start locking down your stuff as easily as possible. Sounds boring, but it's actually really easy. Same thing, I'm just going to break it down into a few slides so that you know what's good enough. And then I'm going to talk about, for the DBAs in the room who've been snooping in, how to conquer CX Packet and master MaxDOP in 10 minutes. So that's a lightning talk. If you want to save money on registering for PASS, use discount code 24HOP14, save yourself a couple $100. And I know when I was a database administrator, I always thought, well, my company's supposed to be the one to pay for this, and my company's too cheap, so I can't do it. Here's what you do. You go to your boss and say, I want to go to this conference over there. It's going to cost me some money. It's not going to be cheap. And I understand that you don't want to pay for my ticket to get in because it is expensive. How about this? How about you pay, just make sure that I don't have to take vacation time. I am technically at work that week, and I'll eat the cost of the conference and the travel. I'll find room share people. I'll do Airbnb, whatever it is to keep my costs really low. It is a lot of money. It's going to be a couple $1,000 US by the time it's all said and done. But the thing is, you're going to learn amazing stuff, and it's an investment in your career. And if your company won't pay for it, you will meet a lot of people who would like to hire you at PASS. I know a lot of people who I've said, oh, I've heard you're looking for a job. I know you from PASS. I'll hook you up with this company right over here. Because companies want to hire the kind of people who are passionate enough about their career to go to PASS. It's a fantastic way to network. I know it seems like a lot of money, but when you get a better DBA job, it won't seem like that much money. And coming up next is Brian Knight, actually the first professional presenter I ever saw on my way up as a database administrator. Saw Brian Knight present at a user group in South Florida, and I remember taking notes, and like my last note that I took was, whenever I want to learn something about business intelligence, I'm going to Brian Knight. Fantastic BI teacher, really makes complex things very approachable. He's a lot of fun to watch. Even if you don't do SSIS work, he's pretty fun to watch. Mark Mathis asks, what permissions do us evil DBAs need to grant to developers to run the Blitz scripts? That's a wonderful question. And I'm going to jump back a few slides to show you something. So if you go to ozar.me/get/confident and you go to the SP Ask Brent page, I have a tutorial on how to give permissions to the stored procedure, not to the people who are running the stored procedure. Oh my gosh, security sounds so boring. It sounds so awful. I hate learning about security. It's like one of the topics I won't touch as a consultant, but it is mind-blowingly easy to grant permissions to a stored proc and then let anybody run it. You have to, there's a certificate involved, relax, you can do it in 10 lines of T-SQL, and I'm not even talking like 1,000 lines of SQL, and I give you the exact script on how to do it on that page. This is because I also give this to help desk people, developers, anybody. I want them to be able to go off and run who is active in SP Ask Brent. They require sysadmin level permissions. But unfortunately, you don't usually want to give those out to the help desk, so you just grant it to the stored procedure instead. Jason Horner says, cool session, bro. Would have liked to have seen you spend more time talking about Atom Mechanics' magical tool. Amazing tool. I call it Atom Mechanics' amazing tool, and it is amazing. Matt says, great stuff. I've seen the database going really slowly because people religiously kept to the 5 indexes rule of thumb. As you said, it is a rule for most tables only. Yeah, anytime you see people follow anything like a religion, it's going to backfire sooner or later. There's almost no hard and fast rules inside the database world. So that is the end of the questions that folks have asked. Oh, Bernard asks, let me hit one other one. Bernard says, is performance tuning the same for the in-memory objects for SQL Server 2014? Let me tell you a little story, buddy. Here's the deal. The in-memory stuff goes faster because they stripped out all the features. So if you think you're going to be doing any kind of management through the dynamic management views, or getting index hints, or even adding an index to your Hackathon in-memory OLTP stuff, think again. Read the restrictions on that extremely carefully. There are a minefield of challenges with Hackathon in-memory objects. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that they are a very specialized tool, and they are in version 1, so to speak. This is the first time that they've ever come out. I have this thing about version 1 technologies. I like to wait for version 2. First off, I want to make sure that they actually work. There are known bugs in Hackathon right now. There's a service or a hotfix out that if you insert too many rows at a time, it blows chunks. That's not what I call really high performance. So you got to be really careful with that and read the books online sessions on that extremely carefully. So that's everything we've got there in terms of questions. I want to thank everybody. I believe we've got the last slide here to say thank you. Thanks everyone for attending. I'll let you out a little bit early so that you can go jump into Brian Knight's session, which I would highly recommend if you ever do any BI work. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks very much, Brent. That was a great session.
Thanks, Vicki.